Hi, everybody. Welcome to the third session of our conference on deglobalization and anti-globalism in Central Europe. Thank you to so many of you for attending today. We will be having 4 presentations today, each around 15 minutes, and I'm going to introduce the panelists, each of them right before they speak. If you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A box and I'll read them out. Or you can, if you're one of the participants in the conference, you can type your question into the chat button. But we'll be hearing all 4 presentations before we move to the Q&A. So our first speaker today will be Jamie Martin. Jamie Martin is an assistant professor of history at Georgetown University, and he's currently finishing a book project on the political origins of global economic governance after the First World War. And we'll be hearing him talk about that work today. Thanks, Jamie.
Great. Thank you, Tara. Thank you, everyone out there in the digital world. I'm very glad you're here, and I wish I could see you all, but thank you for being here. So the paper that I wrote up for this conference is basically an abridged version of a chapter from my forthcoming book. This chapter looks at the episode of 1920s financial reconstruction in Europe, kind of response to the financial instability of the aftermath of the First World War. So as well known, the hyperinflations that gripped much of Central Europe, and certainly the former Central Powers, Austria, Hungary, and Germany, were among the worst challenges or the most profound challenges to the stability of Europe after the First World War. They also provided an opportunity for some of the first experiments in using an intergovernmental economic organization to actually do something. And these were the financial stabilization loans that the League of Nations facilitated to some of its member states. These were classic conditional loans, as the term would become common later. They involved the appointment of foreign advisors to enforce domestic schemes of fiscal austerity, ensure central bank independence, and control public assets that were pledged as securities on these loans. So later, these loans were seen among some of the greatest successes of the League, some of the few successes of the League of Nations as an organization overall. They were also taken to be evidence that this rather new idea of international economic governance could actually become a real possibility. Much later, they were widely recognized as a kind of a prelude or an antecedent to the kind of loans that the IMF would make in the aftermath of the Second World War, and then of course much later in its structural adjustment programs. But in the 1920s, these loans and the kinds of derogations of sovereignty that they involved generated a huge backlash to the League of Nations and to the Bank of England and to financial institutions involved with them, and through the whole project of international economic governance into some uncertainty. So this is where my chapter kind of speaks to some of the themes of this conference more broadly. Now, the Austrian case is the best known case of the League's financial reconstructions, and there's been some recent work that's been particularly excellent in exploring the complexities of this episode. What I do in my paper and in my chapter is show how the Austrian case kind of fit into a much broader political problem, a political problem whose kind of stakes become clearer when the Austrian case is put into the context of other League attempted and successful loan projects in Albania, Bulgaria, Liberia, Portugal, Yugoslavia, quite disparate contexts. And what I demonstrate in this chapter is that the political questions raised by the League loans were not limited, though they included, but they were not limited to the problems of handling the breakup of the Habsburg Empire. Instead, they led to controversies around the world, from Chile to West Africa to India to nationalist China, and so on. So the principal reason why these loans became so politically explosive, or one of the principal reasons, was because they involved an adaptation of what were very clearly semi-colonial practices from the 19th century. Forms of financial control that were used in semi-sovereign countries or countries whose sovereignty was being kind of coercively attenuated. Now these tools were the kind of the prospect of adapting these tools to an era of self-determination and democratization in Europe was quite uncertain. Essentially, the League would have to assume a role of the kind of foreign debt commissions that had been set up in places like the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, Tunis, Bulgaria, Greece, and China in the 19th century. So the way these commissions worked was roughly by taking control over certain public assets, state monopolies, and supervising public spending. Oh, comment there. Sorry. To ensure that foreign bondholders were repaid and that debts didn't go into default. So the idea of using an international, kind of a internationalized debt commission like this in Central Europe after the First World War was seen as an extremely explosive suggestion. The idea of kind of internationalizing a form of semi-colonialism that had been commonly used in North Africa and the Middle East and China in really the heart of Europe, so to speak. What I explore in my book, or how I explore this case in my book, is by looking at how the political stakes of this process were dealt with against the backdrop of a broader and longer term struggle to define what the involvement of external actors in the domestic economic affairs of sovereign states, what the kind of legitimate bounds of that external involvement could be. So at the end of the First World War, it was an almost universally acknowledged maxim of power in a hierarchical international order that allowing non-nationals any real say over domestic economic questions kind of amounted to an uncomfortable admission of lower standing or damaged sovereignty, even civilizational or racial standing in an international origin of damaged sovereignty. And so this became very clear in the early 1920s, when the first attempt of the League to provide the services of technical and financial experts to a member state completely collapsed. And this wasn't in Austria, but this was in a rather different country, Albania, a Muslim majority, financially unstable former territory of the Ottoman Empire that was undergoing a process of democratization, attempting to kind of defend its territory and sovereignty, and was a League member state, and that continued to face real threats on its territory from neighboring states. So the idea was that Albania's financial stabilization could be used to help stabilize the Balkans more generally. Sorry, my contact disappeared. Am I back now in real time?
You're back, Jamie.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. I don't know what happened. I'm in Washington, D.C., and the world is kind of falling apart here. So forgive me if I cut out again. I'll try to speed up here so I can get done before the whole world falls apart. So anyway, so we're in Albania, the complex political scenario, the idea that the League officials involved in this initiative are adapting semi-colonial models while at the same time recognizing that they can't just run roughshod over the sovereignty of a member state in the context of attempting to kind of legitimate claims to self-determination and demonstrate that the League of Nations in this relatively weak, relatively semi-sovereign Balkan country like Albania can really defend Albania's sovereignty. So on the one hand, they directly look for a financial advisor in Albania who is somebody who comes directly from a colonial administration, and they're particularly interested in someone with experience in the Dutch East Indies, not least because they regard this
I think we've lost Jamie again. I'm gonna wait a second to see if he comes back.
kind of a Dutch. Okay. My back, I'm sorry. I've taught a whole semester, multiple classes, and this has never happened, and now it's happening now. I guess I'll do the best I can here. I'm sorry. Right. Okay. So basically, the point is that the League arrives. The League sends this advisor to Albania, attempting to empower him to coerce the Albanian, neutralize the Albanian parliament, get this dramatic scheme of austerity enforced externally, and the whole thing blows up in their face and doesn't work. The kind of next step on the path is Austria, a much better known context, in which the explosive political stakes of essentially internationalizing these semi-colonial forms of financial control are wrestled with. And they're wrestled with in a way that results in a successful program of financial reconstruction, but one that generates major controversy around the world, is interpreted in places, as I mentioned, as disparate as China, South America, and India, as essentially compelling the Austrian state to admit to lower standing on the international stage. So I don't even know if I'm still broadcasting live to the audience here, but suffice to say that my paper explores the intricate political contexts of the kind of innovation of conditional loans and their origins in the aftermath of the First World War, which raises fraught questions about roughly analogous to questions of deglobalization as they would become as they would be termed later. But I suppose I'll leave it at that, and perhaps later, if the situation here stabilizes, I'll make some further comments. But I'll leave it at that for now, and I apologize about my connection.
Thank you, Jamie. Sorry about the connection as well. Don't worry, but hopefully we'll have a chance to discuss your paper more in the Q&A. Our next speaker will be Malgorzata Mazurak. She's an associate professor of Polish studies in the Department of History at Columbia University. Her interests include the social and intellectual history of modern Poland and East Central Europe. And her new book project, which is under contract with Cornell University Press, which I think has the title, The Economics of Here-ness, deals with Polish developmental thought and the making of the non-Western world from 1918 to 1968. Malgorzata, the floor is yours.
And thank you, Tara, and thanks to everyone for showing up. I will share my screen. I hope this is working. Okay. This presentation is about creative experiments in social science that took place in interwar Poland during the Great Depression. And it's a follow-up to Jamie Martin's paper, who investigated stabilization loans for East Central Europe. Great Depression stopped basically the flow of any kind of loans to East Central Europe and to Poland in particular. And so the consequences of the Great Depression was not just a structural lack of capital, but also obviously joblessness, and also no access to job markets outside Poland that traditionally provided work opportunities for Eastern Europeans. And by this I mean the job markets in North America, in South America, and elsewhere and also in Europe. So the paper, this presentation is briefly about Polish left-wing intelligentsia thinking through this predicament and asking themselves a question what it meant to stay out of work during the Great Depression in a country that was poor, that was agrarian, that was not industrialized, and how to think about work, labor, and also how to measure it in the context of economic devolution, political isolation, and a sense of social political claustrophobia that also translated into ethnic tensions. So there are several contexts to that story. One is obviously national, how to think about national economy in an era of deglobalization, put it more broadly. And so the framework is decidedly national here. Second context is international. And by this, I mean the crisis of the politics of gold standard and austerity measures that new East Central European countries followed in the 1920s. Poland as a nation state was loyal to gold standard during the Great Depression, which resulted in even bigger unemployment. So much of the thinking that and social scientific knowledge that I will show here is the reaction, is a critique of this orthodoxy of gold standard that Poland embraced and hang on to during the Great Depression. The third context is intellectual, social, scientific. Unemployment was a very problematic category in countries of rural East Central Europe. Why? Because to think about joblessness why? Because unemployment historically was a concept that was tied to the market and to the state. It was visible only as far as it was detected via bookkeeping and market exchange. But unemployment outside market and the state remained invisible. And much of the economic activity that happened in poor agrarian East Central Europe took place outside the market and outside the state. It was the domain of household economy, small businesses that didn't run any books and didn't report to any office. It was a domain of peasant farming that also operated outside market and the state because it was self-sufficient. So measuring unemployment in interwar Poland was much more a complex task than it was in industrialized states such as United States and Great Britain or other countries like Germany. This also, so there's moving to my story, this to think about unemployment in East Central Europe was to think about a rather small fragment of the economy, which was industrial economy. Everything that was outside of it was described as overpopulation. It was described in demographic terms. And so here you can see the map of East Central Europe provided by the British economist Doreen Warriner, who did not think about joblessness in the countryside as about in terms of unemployment, but rather in terms of overpopulation, which was the mainstream way of thinking about crisis in the countryside. So here I just show you briefly that the blue color here shows people employed in industrial economy, and as you see, this is not rather it's a minority of the unemployed. So this is a structural context to the story of unemployment in the interwar period. People who are thinking about how to change the perception of the unemployment in interwar Poland, and therefore redefine the way to think about the world economic crisis in this particular local context, were different scholars, many women, and also men, obviously, economists, statisticians, social scientists. The person whom I would like to focus on is not Halina Krachelska, who is definitely a very important figure in understanding how unemployment was reconfigured, but Ludwik Landau, who was the leading economist in the Polish Institute of Business Cycles and Prices. And I basically wrap up my story. The whole effort behind, the intellectual effort behind his work that I would like to briefly summarize is rethinking unemployment in the rural context. He was persuaded that joblessness was not just a question of statistical measurement, objective statistical measurement, but the access to how measure it goes through oral accounts and autobiographies. So in the interwar, during the Great Depression, there was a boom of autobiographical writing, and also unemployed and other discriminated groups were asked to write about their experiences. So he believed that superfluousness that many unemployed wrote about was a more capacious and a larger way of thinking about joblessness than a legal and statistical category of unemployment. And during the 1930s, he introduced and incorporated subjective notion of joblessness into his statistical research of unemployment. The result of it was the creation of the category of hidden unemployment, hidden peasant unemployment in particular, and also youth unemployment, as category that notified unemployment outside of state and market context. So the what I would like to say just at the very end is that this is a very the unemployed that received any money or allowances during the Great Depression in Poland was actually very small. If you look at the numbers, and on the right side you see the unemployed, the officially registered unemployed in, say, 1933 were just a bit less than 800,000 people. That was not really much in a country that had 32 million people, and many of the adults were effectively unemployed. So the invention of the hidden unemployment, to wrap up my story, was to point at social welfarist measures to deal with the Great Depression in poor agrarian Poland, and point at huge, vast categories of people who are effectively unemployed and to integrate them into welfare policies. This really did not happen during the Great Depression because Poland was loyal to gold standard until 1936, which meant that monetarist fixes and austerity measures got the upper hand. Nevertheless, the invention of the hidden unemployment had bigger consequences for developmental thinking in the long run, informing the ways in which international experts, some of them coming from East Central Europe during the 30s, redefined their idea of unemployment. And this new way of thinking about broader conception of unemployment became one of the foundations of developmental schemes after World War II. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Malgorzata. We'll be moving on next to a presentation by Philipp Ther. He is professor of Central European history at the University of Vienna and the author of many books, but I'll just mention two. Europe Since 1989, a history published by Princeton University Press in English and recently also published in German. And The Outsiders, Refugees in Europe Since 1492, which was also published in English by Princeton University Press. Philipp, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll try to share the screen. Okay, I don't succeed in that. You should share only parts of it. Well, let's see. Hopefully that works. Okay, I hope that everybody can now see the slides. If not, then please interrupt me. I should have a full picture of that. Okay, here we go. Well, so this is on Karl Polanyi, and I'll start out with a brief biography or a biographical introduction. I hope I'm excused by anybody in the audience who knows Polanyi much better or too well, and probably better than I do, like Quinn. This is just a brief overview. Now, I won't, this is a picture of Polanyi, a young editor in the 1920s, and then already a little more seasoned academic in post-war United States. Now, I won't repeat what you see on the slide, no PowerPoint karaoke. I will just mention that there were three major phases in his life. He started out as a radical socialist student, where in Budapest, where he was in contact with fellow-minded intellectuals such as George Lukács. He came of a middle-class Jewish family. Then in the interwar period, his very productive time, he worked as an editor at Der Österreichische Volkswirt, so that was an economic journal with a leftist outlook. He also was an adherent of the Social Democratic Red Vienna. And then there's a third phase where he spent his life in exile, first in Great Britain, then in the US. Where he worked as a visiting professor at Columbia University. And in exile, he also wrote his opus magnum, The Great Transformation. Now I'll switch off this again and return to my regular presentation. Where are we? Okay. Stop. Now, where can we put Polanyi academically? He studied law and philosophy. As an editor, he wrote about a large array of topics. As an academic, he taught mainly economic history. Nevertheless, in my view, he was mainly a historical sociologist and, of course, also a revisionist Marxist. His political outlook oscillated between radical socialism, already mentioned, and what one can interpret as reform-oriented social democracy. Hence, he can be interpreted, and he is interpreted in different ways. Nancy Fraser, John Bachman, and these, this interpretability adds to his attraction. Now, the second part of my paper was dedicated to the Renaissance of Kolani, since the 1980s, or rather than the turn of the millennium eventually. Why did he become even fashionable again? Well, he grew out of fashion since the 1970s for around 2 decades, when he looked like a remnant of a long bygone socialist past. He simply didn't fit into the age of Reaganomics and Thatcherism. But then he gained traction with each crisis of global capitalism. First, the Asian financial and dot-com crisis, so at the turn of the millennium, and then especially the financial and economic crisis between 2008 and 2011. So his demand for an embedded capitalism and his critique of what he called global laissez-faire capitalism looked very timely again, and in a way, one might argue that what we basically got again in the age of neoliberal hegemony was a kind of global laissez-faire capitalism. Now, let's move back. I'm not an intellectual historian, but rather a political theorist, but rather a social historian, and therefore I have put Polanyi into the context of the interwar period in the subsequent subchapter of my paper. As I mentioned, he was an adherent of the Red Vienna, for which he provided intellectual manpower. He accepted local markets, but he criticized the social disruption resulting from open markets, free trade, and the international monetary system based on the gold standard. So that leads us back to the excellent first paper you heard, when in Austria there was hyperinflation and gold standard, but well, the result was, one of the results was currency stabilization, but also mass impoverishment, and he simply was against it. Let's now move back to the PowerPoint. Here, okay. That was the biography. I mean, here you see 2 exemplars of the Österreichische Volkswehr. I will skip over that because there's a lack of time. But what you can see here is that he indeed wrote about a lot of things. Now, you know, once England and the Abyssinian War, America in the melting pot. So, you know, very, very guided public intellectual, I would say. Now, in his opus magnum, The Great Transformation, you see the original edition, he contended that global laissez-faire capitalism is impoverishing and uprooting too many people, and that it creates a need for social protection. Besides embedded capitalism, this is one of his key terms. Now, in his view, that protection was offered by Red Vienna with its housing program and market regulation, and by democratic socialism. That was his big hope, that eventually all the disruptions and the havoc created by global laissez-faire capitalism would lead to a turnover and then to democratic socialism. Now, of course, in the 1930s, he also witnessed how his dream, democratic socialism, failed to materialize. And so I think we can read his opus magnum also as kind of a socio-economic longue-durée interpretation for the rise of fascism. It maybe deals with the long 19th century, but nevertheless, I think it can be interpreted in this way. Let's now come to the last part of my presentation, also of my paper. How could Polanyi be used for the critical historical study of globalization and deglobalization? We also had a debate about that, a lively one before. Now, to be sure, Polanyi did not use the term globalization. Yet I think we can take his work as inspiration, starting point to think about that term, and subsequently maybe about deglobalization. Of course, the D and without the participle, that would mean that we rather remain in a kind of dialectical pattern. And I think one of the results of the previous discussion was also that, of course, globalization and the movements against what is understood as globalization in neoliberal terms is very variegated, and so that can be too simplistic, this binary movement. But anyway, what Polanyi took as global laissez-faire capitalism, so what he criticized as his critical take on globalization, if we want to boil it down to a definition of globalization, I think, according to Polanyi, that would be a global currency regime, gold standard, global trade, open markets, and as a nucleus already, he thought about an international division of labor. Now, I would like to introduce you to the work of another major sociologist who has worked on our most recent period of globalization, Manuel Castels. He wrote a 3 volumes of trilogy, and where he put forward the free flow of information propelled by the World Wide Web, the formation of global networks. So if you would add that to Polanyi, which is my decision to do that, I'm not sure about whether Castels really referred to Polanyi that much. I would have to check that. But anyway, if we do that, then we can add to Polanyi's definition of global laissez-faire capitalism, or his thought about globalization in a way. We could add here with Castels information and connectivity. Now, that is fine, but I think one key element of globalization is missing here, and it is missing in much of the great transformation by Polanyi, and that is migration, the free flow of people. Now, why is migration important for defining globalization and maybe also deglobalization? Because this is where you can see the most pronounced rupture after World War I. After World War I, of course, there still was a continuation, trying an attempt to restore the gold standard and some of the laissez-faire capitalism, which then Polanyi criticized. But I think the most pronounced break was indeed in the interruption of a lot of international migration, and especially transatlantic migration. After World War I, we see a brief period of post-imperial migration and flight, but then above all, we see the closure of very many borders, and as I mentioned before, especially to the US, 1921 and 1924 with the Immigration Act. And so if we then use Polanyi as a point of departure, add another sociologist, Castels, then I think one can get to an attempt to define globalization by trade, finance, and migration. Now, this overview, this file I took from Our World in Data, I don't know how accurate it is, but I think it's not a bad first step. Now, what Polanyi, and with that I will end, what Polanyi also argued is that if you have too much of a free market, especially on this global scale and laissez-faire capitalism, that creates counter movements, a double movement. Now, a double movement to what he termed as social protection, so a rising need of social protection. Now, I've interpreted this kind of idea of a double movement in the sense of a pendulum, that here on the one side is, so to say, the free global market and laissez-faire capitalism, and if that swings too far in that direction, and that's my reading of Polanyi, which might be disputed, that then the pendulum can swing in the other direction to social protection. Now, where does it swing then? From social protection, from the need of social protection, which Polanyi leaves kind of in the air. I mean, he doesn't really stress actors who fight for social protection, at least not in the interwar period, or specific political parties going after that. Where does it move to, this pendulum? And as I mentioned before, Polanyi was hoping for a movement towards the left, that it moves on to the left and to what he termed democratic socialism. But then eventually in his book, I think it was also an attempt to explain why the pendulum moved eventually further on in the direction of right-wing nationalism and fascism. And I think this very idea was one of the reasons why Polanyi was perceived again as being so timely in our most recent period of globalization, and of course in the age of neoliberal hegemony. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Philipp. Our final presentation will be from Quinn Slobodian, who teaches at Wellesley College. His most recent book, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, was published by Harvard University Press. It recently won the AHA's George Louis Beer Prize and has translations completed or underway in 5 languages. Quinn, the floor is yours. I also just want to remind everybody in the audience that you can already at any point type your questions into the Q&A box or the chat. So as soon as Quinn finishes his presentation, we'll open the floor for questions for any of the 4 panelists or to all of them. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much to the organizers and all my co-presenters and to everybody for showing up. I had a peek at the participants and there's many friends there, so it's only a shame we have to do it this way and not all go to the bar afterwards. Okay, so the topic of today, of the workshop that's been ongoing now over a couple of months is deglobalization and anti-globalism. And one of the things we've been talking about and hopefully we'll continue to talk about in the Q&A is how we define something like deglobalization. There's a kind of subtext here that we're interested in histories of backlash, especially from the right. But the question is hanging in the air whether or not deglobalization is the best way to think about the political economy and the economic imagination of the different forms of rightism that have emerged from Central Europe across the 20th century and into the 21st. And my argument, as we'll see today through the example of the Alternative for Germany Party, is that we would be better off thinking about a kind of selective globalization or an alternative globalization of the right, rather than adopting the binary framework of globalization and deglobalization, which can be, in my opinion, quite misleading. So the segment I'm going to present today, just in about 10, 15 minutes, is drawn from a book that I'm working on right now about the rise of what I call the hard market right. So this is an attempt to kind of conceptualize the political imagination that's emerging from what have been called kind of backlash, populist, or far-right political mobilizations, but thinking about them as kind of varieties of neoliberal globalization rather than simply backlash or rejection of it. One of the things that unite the actors in the book I'm writing is that they tend to be skeptical about integration and international cooperation, and they seem to be more invested in disintegration and secession. This can lead superficially to the impression that they are deglobalists, but in fact, it's simply a different way of controlling what they see as a global economic landscape. The hard market right, as I talk about, are united by a belief in hard borders, hard money, and hardwired culture, essentialism around categories of culture and often race. So the paper today, the presentation today is really focusing in on this question of hard money and through the example of the Alternative for Germany or AFD party, which I see as an example of one of these hard market right constellations. So the AFD might not be that well known to people who are not studying Central Europe or living in Central Europe, but they're currently the official opposition in the Bundestag and the German parliament. they have a fairly large representation, as you can see from the graphic. And they're often covered, especially in the American media, particularly in terms of their Islamophobic, anti-migrant, and their pro-natalist chauvinism, often edging towards a scientific racism and a kind of restorationist neo-Nazism in many cases. But it is often overlooked, at least in the overseas coverage, that they began as a party founded by renegade economists whose idea of an alternative was not an alternative to Europe as a kind of civilizational or cultural or racial space, but an alternative to the euro as a particular form of managing the monetary union. And they were arguing for a departure from the European monetary union and calling for either the return to the Deutschmark, or, as we'll see in the example of people I talk about in a minute, the desire to move back, above all, to something more like a gold-backed currency, of which the world hasn't seen since at least the 1970s, when the United States became the last major power to leave something like the gold standard. So how is the AFD understood nowadays? Nowadays, conventionally, it's understood as having kind of, even for those who know the history, two wings. You can see them, humorously represented here in a Cologne carnival float. The blue wing is the liberal wing, i.e. that still associated with these kind of right-wing neoliberal economists who were anti-Euro and pro-fiscal discipline, anti-welfare state, and so on, which, as pictured in this float, is seen to have shrunk over time to a kind of a vestigial stub, while the extreme right wing, which is less interested in economic questions and more interested in questions of culture, has grown to kind of eclipse the party altogether. Well, I think that this is a kind of an overly convenient and tidy way of thinking about the development of the ideology, sort of from economics to culture. And through the example of gold, I think we can talk about an AFD imaginary that actually unites questions of culture and money, sort of currency and civilization. So we can do this, or we should do this in part by being aware of the fact that gold has become extremely popular in Germany since the 2008 crisis. This is something that sort of gold brokers and consultants have had their eye on, because conventionally, India, in fact, has sort of held the crown for the highest amount of private holdings since 2008. As you can see from the graph, Germany has surged back. And there are a number of ways, won't be able to get into it all in the next 10 minutes, that one can see the kind of openness of the German population for Eurosceptic political positions, and specifically Euro as in the currency skeptic positions, as being grounded in a kind of an anger at the fact that their savings are either not accumulating the kind of interest that they would hope under what is effectively a zero interest policy, or that they're searching for what they see as an asset that is not controlled by governments, but somehow in their minds exists outside of the control of a democratic state apparatus. So the AFD, my argument would be, saw this very clearly, and they tapped into it quite early. And this happened in what I think is kind of an amazing anecdotal way, which is that when the AFD joined the European Parliament, they had the right for matching funds from the German federal state, but they needed to raise money themselves before getting those matching funds. And normally, political parties would charge dues for membership into their political party and then use that as a match for the funds from the state. The AFD didn't do that. They had a very small membership base. And so what they chose to do instead is to open a gold shop. So in 2014, they just opened an online gold shop that started selling Krugerrands, Australian kangaroos, Chinese pandas, Canadian maple leafs. It went as far as selling gold bars signed by the AFD leaders at the party congress. And they were doing this, they were framing this in a very interesting way. If you read the sort of the fine print in the pitch that they were selling, they were basically saying, we can't trust the German democratic system as it exists now, because it is anchored to this European monetary system, which is beholden to what they saw as a policy of monetary socialism, quote unquote, which meant quantitative easing, the printing of more and more euros, the easing of credit, such that whole populations could be kind of, in their mind, bought off through social policy. Critically, they also believed this meant that refugees and migrants could be welcomed in because new printed euros would simply fund all of the new programs that would be used to build homes for them, create jobs for them, etc. So this is a fantastical idea, obviously, of the policy that was going on. But the argument was, here's an exit hatch, here's an escape from the European Union and from Germany itself, and we're giving it to you in the form of gold. And when we sell you this gold coin, we'll sell it to you at a slightly inflated rate. And with the profit we make, we'll get matching funds from the German federal state itself to continue to participate in the democratic process. So there's a sort of a remarkable way in which they were actually being subsidized by the state to preach anti-democratic positions and positions that were skeptical of the existence and the legitimacy of the German state itself. And they were extremely successful. They made over 4 million euros in a short time that the online gold shop was open, which was a lot for them in their early stages of their party. And the law was subsequently changed to prevent them from being able to do so anymore. There was an interesting kind of twist in this story that happened that tells us something more about the kind of the base behind what you could call the kind of supply side of the AFD, which is that it turns out that this gold itself was being supplied by a company called Degussa. And Degussa was owned by an 88-year-old German billionaire named August von Fink Jr., who actually lives in Switzerland to avoid taxes in Germany, and recently bought up what you would call a heritage brand of Degussa. Heritage brand because it had been long defunct after having been the company that had was one of its subsidiaries Cyclone B, and also was the gold company that processed the extracted gold teeth of the murdered victims of the concentration camps. So for good reason, after the Second World War, this firm and its name fell into disrepute. August von Fink Jr. bought and revived the Degussa brand and in 2010. And his first sort of political act after this was to begin directly funding the AFD. And he was, he clearly has sympathies for the German nationalist past, let's say, but he's also kind of a typical tax haven neoliberal. He wants to escape accountability by the taxing and redistributing state. He believes in hard assets that can avoid democratic control. So he perfectly combines this combination of the currency as a space of kind of racial purity and as a space of extra democratic and extra national container of value. The person who best represents this now as a kind of ideology, who has developed it the most clearly, is a man named Peter Boehringer, who is now still sitting in the Bundestag as, in fact, the chairman of the parliamentary committee, the budget committee in the Bundestag. And Boehringer is a classic Goldbug. So he got his start got his start working for Booz Allen Hamilton, the consulting agency, the same one that Snowden worked for. And then he started something called the Precious Metals Society in 2007. He ran a precious metals blog called Goldzeiten or Gold Pages, and was heavily involved in right-wing libertarian circles, joined the Hayek Society in 2012, wrote for the paleo-libertarian magazine Eigentümlich Frei beginning in 2012. And he is a classic Goldbug. So he believes that the US Fed, which he calls the creature from Jekyll Island, was setting the United States and world economy on a path to ruin. He calls the paper money system, quote, the tinder that will set the world on fire. In other words, in other works, he argues about the coming collapse of the world economy and the need to do things like keep yourself physically fit, stockpile food and drinking water, and to prepare, in short, for the coming monetary apocalypse, against which he is then willing to offer to sell you, right, the only protection there is, which is gold coins, gold bars, and other precious metals. So he has a kind of incredible flair for public relations. Clearly, he ended up in the Bundestag eventually. But he also staged a quite amazing campaign called Repatriate Our Gold, or Holt unser Geld heim, which brought to public attention the fact that much of the German gold reserves were actually being held by the Fed in New York City, actually, since the end of the Second World War. They had been accumulating there because of the fear of them being possessed or taken by the Soviets in the case of an invasion from the East. And Boehringer said, this money should come home. Why is it there? He raised all kinds of sort of conspiratorial, skeptical points about the fact that this gold might not actually be there. Was it ever actually there? How do we know it's there? And he was actually successful enough that the Bundesbank followed his campaign, folded to his campaign, and brought over a big chunk of the gold from New York back to Frankfurt in 2017. And they even put out a display where people could come and see the gold. And they said that, in fact, they were doing this because there were questions being raised about whether the gold was actually there. And to me, this is kind of like an amazing moment, because they're actually just setting up what is a kind of an impossible dynamic, right? Instead of direct democracy, which is something we associate the far right with a lot, where the mediating institution of the legislature is sort of removed in favor of a plebiscite or a referendum, this gold display is kind of a bid for direct economy, right? It's kind of a fractional reserve optics, this idea that we can see a little bit of the gold. It's almost like we can see all of it. The citizen investor then can come through and kind of receive an unmediated encounter with what they see as the final guarantor of value. But of course, this is an impossible demand to live up to. It's the literal equivalent, the monetary equivalent of asking for Obama's birth certificate. The presentation of the artifact itself only proves then to the original questioner that something further is being concealed. So this sort of series of open questions has been very effective as a mobilization tactic for the far right, from the AfD to the people who stormed the Capitol this week, obviously. And I think we have to be sort of attentive to the ways that these narratives get built up, not only through questions of culture and race, but specifically through questions of control of the money supply and the history of things like central banks, which have now become, of course, central questions for the far right in their appeals to people in a moment when the tie between money and value seems like perhaps more fragile than in a long time. So I want to wind up here, but I want to do so by saying a little bit about what this might make us do to reconceptualize what we think of as the far right in Germany. So this is a wonderful image from Boehringer's blog of Marx over Frankfurt. And the argument implicit and explicit here is that the European Union, which pretends to be a guardian of the capitalist order, is in fact the enabler of a new socialist order. Migrants are simply either witting or unwitting dupes of this system. They're being drawn in to reproduce a stratum of elite managers, both within and outside of state bureaucracy. And the only way that we can express our opposition to this hardening stratum of the elite is through voting for far-right parties, mobilizing on their behalf, and also buying gold, which amazingly enough, Boehringer calls the sit-down strike and Gandhian hunger strike of our generation, the act of purchasing bars of gold. It's only this way, he says, that the, quote, paper money totalitarians of modern central banks can be defeated. So this kind of gold fetish of the far right doesn't really appear in the tsunami of takes about the current populist wave that we've been reading for the last 4 years. Why? I think because it doesn't really fit cleanly into the common framework that we use that casts the far right as sort of avatars of a closed society against advocates of the open society that supposedly pre-existed 2016. Historically, gold has obviously been a symbol of connection, not isolation. The gold standard was the bedrock of the first age of globalization. And to many classical liberals, it was the metal that kind of bound the world economy together. The far right's fixation on the gold medal expresses both a desire to ground morality in a traditional conception of economic value that in their mind goes back thousands of years. Nothing holds money like gold. But also they're looking to a kind of a more recent era of globalization, I would say, i.e. an era before the European Central Bank, before the US Fed, back before the First World War, a time when they thought, and they think in their minds, finance operated in a way unburdened by supranational governance and regulation. So although by definition, the AFD rejects the slogan of open borders, they offer an ideology themselves of open borders for gold. The nation rests within a golden globe where these precious metals flow freely. And this, far from rejecting globalization, actually deepens it. The idea is that you were able to, through these Gandhian hunger strikes, subject the actions of the state to the continual audit of asset holders with the ability to move their money if they want to. So with monetary policy, as I would say with other political matters, this hard market right isn't a throwback to a supposedly autarkic past, but a throwback to a more interconnected past, if anything, and also a creature clearly of our contemporary moment. Even their demands for sovereignty and autonomy are uttered with one eye on the global picture. Okay, I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Quinn. Okay, we have a number of questions. There they are. I'm going to be reading them off. The questions, starting with a question from Peter Becker to Malgorzata. I think this one comes from this morning. He asks, how close did Polish intellectuals as the heroes of your story work together with Austrian intellectuals around Red Vienna, Paul Lazarsfeld, Maria Hoda, who pioneered the study of unemployment in their Marienthal study, and Otto Neurath, who developed new forms of communicating statistical information to a broader public? Lazarsfeld even appears as co-author in one of the publications you refer to in your paper. I'm going to just read, I think, 3 questions, and then we'll go to the panel just so we can get more questions in. Second question is from Peter Becker again to Quinn, and I'm going to piggyback onto it because I had a similar question. Question to Quinn regarding the conceptualization of globalization and alternative globalization. How do you conceptualize the relationship between political projects, regulatory regimes, and variations in global trade, finance, and circulation of people? I guess I kind of wanted to add to that. I've been convinced by your sort of sustained critique over these weeks, and even in your writings going back to 2016 of the framework of deglobalization for thinking about the contemporary populist right, both that it's, I mean, if I understand you correctly, it's inaccurate and misleading in that it disguises an underlying attachment to the globalization of finance in particular, while the movement of people and goods might or might not be constrained. I guess I wonder if you would say the same about the interwar period. Is it, I mean, having written about this question over the longer durée, is it equally, do you see it as equally misleading to think about the interwar period in terms of anti-globalism or deglobalization, or is the kind of the problem that you're talking about with terminology really limited to the contemporary? And then one last question from Leah Feldman to, again, to Quinn. How does your account of gold compare with other alt currencies, particularly cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, which, like gold, offers the potential for all globalized world building, but is very much a dematerialized, abstract, but also in other ways attached to forms of all global world building, such as online gaming networks? Okay, so that'll be the first round. There's several other questions for the second round, and the Q&A box is also open. Maybe Malgorzata first, and then Quinn.
Thank you, Tara. These are very specific questions, and thank you very much, because they really allow us to dive into transnational connections in the region of East Central Europe. What I would say more generally is that all this conceptual work that had been done during Great Depression around the world obviously had a political dimension, and developing concepts is one thing, communicating them to the public is another issue. In the interwar era, public statistics became a big thing, and Otto Neurath's pictograms and ways of communicating numbers to ordinary people became a big thing for not just left-wing scholars. So I do see the development of public statistics in interwar Poland too, obviously, and Red Vienna was definitely an inspiration, but Great Britain was equally a big inspiration for the people I write about. What I think is most important on a more general level is that creating a concept of hidden unemployment aims to create and address a political constituency, which were unemployed workers, peasantry, and anybody who urban Jews who had small businesses that went bankrupt during the Great Depression. So it was a multi-ethnic constituency encompassing different social classes, both in the cities and in the countryside. So creating a concept that would go beyond urban unemployment meant to integrate wider strata of society that felt disenfranchised and poor and abandoned into the broader concept of unemployment, and which meant pro-welfarist thinking. Maybe to answer this question, I will stop with that. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much to Tara and Peter and Leah for the questions. I think that Adam Getache's name came up in the earlier session, and I think that I really like her work a lot as well. And I think her point applies to the point I'm making in a different way, which is that her argument is that things that often appear as nationalism are in fact need to be understood as their own forms of world making, right? And often arguments even made in terms of what look like economic nationalism are actually alternative forms of world making. So to ask for, let's say, tariff policy or protectionism or import substitute industrialization doesn't mean that you want to opt out of the world, right? It means you have a different idea of how to interact with trading partners and what kind of world economy would be most desirable and just. So I think a lot of the time from the 1920s to the present, we're best off thinking about taking that as a starting point, or as an operating assumption, that whatever we're talking about is not in fact an attempt to deglobalize in the sense of withdrawing connections to the world, but usually it's an attempt of an alternative form of world making. But that's not always true. And in fact, I think one thing I liked about your paper, Tara, and Caroline Taratko's paper is I think those are really great examples of like genuine, earnest efforts at something that looks more like deglobalization, right? There's a real effort to say, how can we create food security, self-sufficiency in such a way that we could, and maybe we even can, separate ourselves from certain forms of global trade and still be sustainable. I mean, those are, then I would say, yes, that's a deglobalization project. The thing is that those don't happen very often. That most mass collective projects in the last 150 years have been based more on a different relationship to the world than less or no relationship to the broader world. To Leah's point, yeah, that's a great question. As you can imagine, and you probably already know, because I'm assuming you're researching this stuff, it's those people that are closest to each other as rivals that are most ferocious in their criticism of each other. So the Goldbugs and the crypto people are like at each other's throats, even though on paper, and in fact, conceptually, they're coming from a very similar place, which is that, you know, central bank managed fiat currency is a recipe for disaster, both current and ongoing. Therefore, we need to find a store of value that is, you know, separated from democratic accountability and control. Some say gold, some say crypto, and they have fierce disagreements over who's right, and they always are celebrating when the value of the other person's preferred asset drops on the world market. The interesting thing that I didn't mention, but I could have mentioned, is that the beginnings of crypto really is Hayek's ideas of the denationalization of money, or his idea of competing currencies. And he first wrote that stuff in the 70s as a contribution to arguments about European monetary integration. So the idea was, should everything move to one single currency, or should there be many competing currencies? Hayek said there should be competing, and wrote two important texts that now all the crypto people go back and see as the sort of the starting point of their own vision now of a fully private currency that is delinked from state systems. So there's even a kind of AFD story there too, because one of Hayek's closest correspondents, Roland Faubel, is then a founding member of the AFD in 2013.
Okay, we have a couple more questions, but we have time for others. So if anybody's holding back, please do type your question into the Q&A or the chat. But first, from Quentin Bruno, a question for Jamie Martin, with apologies if you said this during one of the internet glitches. Do any of the participants in the League of Nations loans have links to the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the International Financial Commission, or similar institutions? And at the tail end of your story, what is the level of continuity between the League of Nations loans and Bretton Woods institutions? For Quinn, Slobodian, how widespread is this gold obsession in other West European far-right parties? Is this only or mostly a German story? And then an additional question just came in from Victoria Schmidt to Quinn. Could we say that Goldbugs operate in the interrelated but different ways of legitimizing German rights as input legitimation, adding attractivity for them, and output legitimation, visualization of their outcomes for the public? If yes, which part of the Goldbugs have obtained in a general strategy of rights to advance them in comparison with other elements of public discourses? For the moment, that seems to be all we have. So I'll turn it back first to Jamie, because I think he might have to leave early.
Okay, I'll try this again. And if I disappear, it's because I'm evading answering your question. No, it's not. So it's a great question. Thank you. As far as I know, there's no direct personnel continuities from the Ottoman Public Debt Administration to the League of Nations. Now, in the case of the International Financial Committee in Greece, it's a little bit more complicated because the League loans to settle the refugees into Greece in the over the 1920s involves working closely with it. So I guess yes and no would be the answer to that. It's not that the kind of personnel is transferring from one institution to the next, but that they're working together, as it were. On the connection to the Bretton Woods institutions, again, it's kind of complex. On the one hand, you know, people like Patricia Clavin have shown, you know, how central some League people are in post-war planning circles in the United States, how kind of central this model of international financial cooperation is, certainly the League publications about it, and how it's held up as a kind of successful model or instance of financial reconstruction. But on the other hand, there's a strong sense in planning, certainly the IMF, that it's precisely to avoid that kind of conditionality, that kind of profound interference in domestic fiscal and monetary affairs that the League did in Central Europe. In fact, some US opponents of the IMF, Republican congressional opponents, for example, bring up the example of the League loans as what's good and what the IMF should do, and what the IMF as kind of constituted, or is apparently constituted at the Bretton Woods Conference.
I think we lost Jamie again. Maybe we'll go.
Isn't going.
Maybe we'll go to Quinn, and then if Jamie comes back, we'll let him finish his question.
It's a great teaser for his book, though.
I know.
You don't have to buy it to know what happened. Okay, so very quickly to those questions. One, I think on the legitimacy question, I mean, I think support for the AfD is a good index of the faltering output legitimacy of the CDU-led government, right? What people see, especially those middle-class savers that constitute actually a large part of the AfD's support base, not just sort of disaffected unemployed Easterners, as is often caricatured. They feel like Merkel is mismanaging government for one reason. The disaffected Easterners feel like she's mismanaging it for another reason. If you take the AfD's support for gold as something that they've been consistent on, which they have been, then you might be actually pleased with the output legitimacy, because the value of gold keeps rising. So in a sense, the argument that they're making, which is the European Monetary Union is bad for German savers, and Mario Draghi is Dragula, as he was depicted in the right-wing press, sucking the savings of the German middle class, then I think they have more to run on. I think that's actually critical to understand the lasting support for the AfD, as seeing them as having an economic argument and not just a cultural or let alone just a racial argument. The other question is about how much of a German specificity this is. It's a good question. So actually, Philipp mentioned this wonderful anecdote about the fact that the Austrian Freedom Party was keeping like a hoard of gold in this shack in the Alps that they would return to in case of monetary apocalypse. And that's pretty consistent, not only with like certain strains of survivalism, but also their policies. So the economic policy, a lot of it for the FPÖ is coming from someone named Barbara Kolm, who is the director of the Hayek Institute, and is very much a critic of the European Monetary Union and believes in the need for sound money and so on. So the German SVP would be similar to the Swiss People's Party in Switzerland. They share this kind of hard money gold predilection. Very different story when you go south and further west. So Melinda Cooper has written a wonderful article called Anti-Austerity on the Right, about how Salvini and the Lega and Le Pen and the National Rally have been at the opposite end of this. They've been critical of the austerity of Frankfurt and the ECB, and arguing that we just need to print more money. They're like wonderful champions of fiat money. So in that case, very different storyline. So it indeed can't be generalized across European far-right movements.
Okay, this is the last call for questions. In the meantime, I'm going to read off the two that we have, but if anybody else has a question, you have a last opportunity to type it up there. First question is to anybody who wants to respond, from Leonard Frederick. Are you familiar with David Graeber's work on department and money? And if so, what do you think about the historical connection he draws between bullion and empire? And then from Victoria Schmidt to Philipp, a question regarding the graph about the dynamics of migration. Is there a long-term continuity in the decrease of migration between the 1920s and 60s, or is it reasonable to indicate the changes in the composition of driving forces and to study the conversion of factors which determine migration? I think that's all we have. So we'll just go one more time to the panelists. If there's anything anybody wants to say, feel free. And why don't we start with Philipp? You're muted, Philipp.
I just started. That gives me, if I have to start, that gives me less time to think about this terrific question. well, the dynamic of migration. I mean that it's so complicated, but anyway, this clampdown on labor migration, as far as I know US history, but I'm not a specialist, this was kept up for quite a while in the post-war period. I know more about the refugees. I mean, there, to have a more general opening for refugees and putting them outside of immigration quota and thus accepting them as a own category. That only happened in the late 1960s. In Europe, well, there's remigration, well, what they call demigration very often. It's flight from the former colonies that may include some former colonial subjects, but it is a very mixed story, and by and large, it's rather a closure than an opening. But anyway, as long as there was a good labor market in the Trente Glorieuses, I mean, they allow a degree of labor migration. So in that way, the closure of interwar period is, at least for European history, there's more of an opening. But then comes the renewed closure after the first oil crisis, and I think this is one of the paradoxes of the recent phase of globalization. Since the 1980s, that on the one hand there is this increase in trade, and then later on it was not part of the graphic, which I don't trust very much. I just found it. There is then this increase in financial connectivity and then global financial capitalism and transborder investments. But at the same time, there are rising prohibitions, first for labor migration. And then I think there's a connection to that. Subsequently, also increasingly closed doors to flight migration, to refugees. So this is what makes it so complicated to talk about globalization as well. If we take these different elements, then it would be good to juxtapose them, but maybe I'm ignorant and I don't read the right books, but I haven't seen, did I see something convincing? There's some of it in Osterhammer, but not really something of a concise attempt to define globalization, various elements, and then weight them, which I think would be needed to get a clearer picture of what we're discussing today. Was there, well, about the history of counter movements, or what Tara just mentioned, the anti-globalists. So it's a little bit murky, I think. What we define as globalization with resulting problems in other areas.
It looks like Quinn has a question for Malgorzata, so I'll pose that.
Yeah, there was just this great stuff in the paper version of what you shared, Malgorzata, about these interviews with people about their experience of being unemployed. It was sort of this sociological realism that reminded me of a journalist, Catherine Boo, wrote this book about people like recyclers in the informal housing districts of Mumbai, like that. And they were very aware of the rising and falling world price of the metals that they were picking from the trash. And I was wondering about this incredibly rich material that you've been reading, were people who were living in like terrible conditions in the backwoods of Poland, were they thinking, I'm in this position because of this thing happening at the level of the world economy? Did they have that sort of scapegoating mentality, or was it all just, mysterious forces that were just collapsing in on their small worlds?
This is a, perfect question to think about my research further. There are different ways to include so-called ordinary people into narratives of globalization, either to try to see them, fit them into the framework that you talk about, although it is, anthropologically informed, etc. Another way to think about it is the, rich international, transnational, global ties that these people have. So you would have an average inhabitant of the Polish countryside, Ukrainian, Polish, maybe Jewish shopkeeper. They would usually have family, you know, on the other continent or in a different country. So I don't think that they really connect. I mean, they connect dots between, you know, depression here and depression there. But I mean, there are people like Rebecca Cobrin who investigates these transnational flows on the level of, you know, people who just count their money, their daily budgets, right, and try to see like what is happening with their, you know, household budget. But I can't answer directly your question other than to say that I think there is a big, I think there's something very natural and self-evident in having the connection to a wider world. But I'm not sure if it is conceptualized through the abstractions such as currency or job market, whether while experts borrow language from the diaries and memoirs, I still would have to see whether the memoir authors borrow any concepts from the discourse that is happening on the level of, you know, in these higher places. So, but thank you.
Okay, I think I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but I want to just thank all of the presenters, everybody who attended today, and the participants in the conference more generally. I hope you'll all join us for our last session in February, which will be fully devoted to the socialist and post-socialist periods. I think there'll be a lot of interest in that. And we can continue some of the conversations we started here today. Otherwise, I wish you all a happy and less eventful new year, and hope to see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.